Welcome to another episode of the Breakneck Podcast with Ian and Matt. We are two founders and product people trying to react to, I think, a very fast-paced set of changes. And there's a few things that are happening right now, just from a very high level. One is people, I think, are really starting to question, man, there's a lot of investment in AI. There must be a bubble. I've heard more of that. I'm not saying it's true or false. Who knows? Who knows? You could have at any time in the last 3 years said, oh, this is a bubble. It's going to immediately collapse. And then it's just gotten 10x bigger. The second thing that I think is very obvious or becoming more obvious to people is that the changes that we've already seen happen in the last 8-9 months are well more than enough to completely change everything, even if all of this investment in infrastructure and new models and things like that turns out to be a wash. So two things can be true simultaneously, that all of these AI valuations get crushed, or they could 10x, who knows? But even if that happened, a lot of the things that we already have, the capabilities that we already have and will definitely be feasible with a much, much smaller level of infrastructure investment are going to radically change everything. And I think the biggest and most prominent of those long-term changes that are here, they're clearly valuable, and they just haven't been adopted beyond maybe 0.5% of people in industry at this point, is the use of code development tools based on AI. So Ian, take us through what's the state of the art?
As you just said it, it's only been 8 or 9 months, right, of this year, and it's been the most hectic thing ever. So I've been kind of ruminating on the arc of AI software development and the sort of three components of that. What are the tool sets capable of now? What does that mean for product development? What does that mean for us as startups and bigger businesses? So let's start with kind of the arc of the tool sets, just to reground people. I did a little bit of reconstructing the history, and I went back, and the first AI tool that I used was something called GitHub Copilot. Launched commercially June 2022, believe it or not. Seems like a long time ago now. And it was essentially autocomplete. And it kind of ruled the roost for about a year or so, and people were blown away by it, but it wasn't anything more sophisticated than that. So that was kind of the first foray into AI development tools, at least that I was aware of and people were generally aware of. Then something super interesting happened towards the back end of 24. We saw Windsurf, as an example, come into existence, an AI-enabled IDE. So an IDE, if you don't know what that is, basically like a word processor for software.
Yeah, my first IDE was JetBrains, where when I was trying to program in, I think, Scala or Java, it's like these super long class names, and then you're like, I'm not typing all that. Which was, once you got used to that autocomplete, but then it was like, I'm not writing the for loop.
Well, and the autocomplete in and of itself was great. But if you're, when you're writing software, you got many, many files, and you'd be in a singular file, and this thing had a context and understanding of a little bit before what was on the screen and a little bit afterwards, and then general practices. So it was great, honestly. Sped things up enormously. But as I said, sort of around this time last year, we started to get wind, excuse the pun, of Cursor and Windsurf and IDEs like that. And then LLMs improved. And then on February 2nd, 2025, something momentous happened. We were introduced to the term vibe coding.
That's when it happened. It was February 2nd.
Yeah. So Andrei Karpathy, I'm sure I've pronounced that incorrectly, said there's a new kind of coding I call vibe coding, where you fully give in to the vibes, embrace the exponentials.
Did not realize it was AK. It was him that did it.
Yeah. So listen to some of this, because it's actually kind of important. You give in to the vibes. It's possible because the LLMs are getting too good. I asked for the dumbest things, like decrease the padding on the sidebar by half because I'm too lazy to find it. I accept all, always. I don't even read the diffs anymore. When I get to error messages, I just copy paste them in with no comment. The code grows beyond my usual comprehension. I'd have to really read through it for a while to understand it. Sometimes the LLMs can't fix a bug, so I just work around it. That was February 2nd, 2025. 4th.
Great history. I love this.
Yeah,
okay, keep going.
March 4th, 2025. A very well-known podcast called the Breakneck Podcast. One of the co-hosts says, I call bullshit on vibe coding. And I might have teed this up a little bit, but I think reading through the post from Andre, you get the sense of like, this is fun, I'm enjoying it, this is great. But suddenly vibe coding was embraced as this the most amazing thing. But those of us in the know a little bit said, well, look, it is very, very powerful, but it has none of the structure, none of the rigor that's really, really needed. So fast forward to today, we're now in a world of what we're beginning to call agentic coding. And I think what the agentic code, what we mean by that really is we're applying the rigor, the best practices of product management, software development, SDLCs, all of that. And we're taking the power of vibe coding and kind of applying that to it. So this week we had GPT-5 Codex launched, which is in the same family as Claude Code. So now you've got much broader context, right? So um, the tool itself understands all your code base. It understands your design patterns. It understands broader best practices. It understands the history and all the rest. So, and I'll give you an example of how I use it right now, and I'm pretty sure this will change in time. I'm both the product manager and the software development for some of the stuff we do. And so I am actually writing PRDs, and we can talk about how I write those, but I'm actually writing kind of specifications. And I'm giving those, in my case, Claude Code. And we're working out what phase of the product we're going to build. It goes ahead, builds a product. It's just like working with an engineer, right? They get halfway through and they go, oh, we never talked about this. We never thought about this thing. And so the Claude Code then updates the PRD in terms of what we changed, what we've done. And so now we're in this phase of gone from autocomplete to vibe coding to actually scalable, mostly rigorous approach to software development that is, I would say, much, much faster. The studies are the results from studies in terms of increase of the velocity are, they're all over the place. Everything, the highest I've seen, 57 to 58% increase in velocity, all the way down to slowing you down by 17%. But I think we've interviewed so far. We've interviewed Designer, Allstacks, Burrow. I'm probably missing some folks. Every single one of those businesses, well, we spoke to them because they were able to launch products quicker.
Yeah, averages don't matter. What
Yeah.
matters is there a subset of the market that is getting 2 to 5x faster? And if you average 2 to 5x faster with 70% slower, yeah, you might get 58% on average. But I know there's a lot of people who experience massive speed ups. And then not just in coding, I've worked with a lot of people who are starting new initiatives, new products, new businesses where I'm partnering with them either as a vendor or they're part of my team. And it's incredible the level of consistency that I get out of people who are AI first. They never I don't 10 years ago, you send somebody something and like, hey, dude, I really need your opinion on this. You might hear back from like 11 or 12 days later, like, hey, I actually really need this. This is blocking me. Oh, sorry, man. The people who use AI, it's like you're going to get something back and you get it back quickly. It's probably worse. But the definite is probably, I don't know. I get bad stuff that people spend a lot of time on, but it's like there's just this velocity to them. And so they always have a good enough all the time. And so they're going in and closing revenue. And at some point you're like, well, if they're closing revenue and yeah, they vibe coded that contract, but it closed, you're like, well, all right. And I'm just seeing more and more of that, just these very productive people or somebody you're like, oh, I have this idea and they come back with a finished version tomorrow and it was vibe coded and it probably isn't production ready, but now we're on step 2. We're not on, what about this?
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that. And by the way, I don't think we're done in terms of the arc of AI software and tools and the way we do it. I think there's more to come, but we've
Yeah,
kind of broken
and
it
let's
back.
differentiate at this point, like make a distinction. The existing quality of code completion or code creation doesn't need to get much better. It's just the way we work with it hasn't caught up. So it's going to get better. And you just saw Codex come out like a week ago, right? But even if they never invested again, like, just really getting back to like, what if it's a bubble? Okay, what if it is a bubble? Codex is that LLM exists. Maybe it'll be like one of these things like ancient Rome, like after the fall of Rome, there'll be these massive buildings that people are like, oh, how could we ever create that? Maybe that'll be LLMs. It's like no one's ever going to put $10 billion into building a coding agent again. Codex has to remain perfect forever. It'll be like these ancient alien artifacts that we have. But even if that's the case, we could still go way, way, way further just leveraging what's happened. The problem is it comes out every couple months. And so we're always lagging years behind the state of the art.
Yeah.
But please go on.
Yeah, so I agree with that, and to kind of carry that forward, the art and craft of product development, and I mean software product development primarily, product management, software development, DevOps, QA. We are still learning how to apply this, and so I think the next 12 months, we got a little bit of a grasp on it now. I think the next 12 months is going to be really interesting. So that said, I think we can zoom out a little bit to the business level and ask ourselves, we're developing software and products quicker, we're doing it more efficiently, we're in the process of restructuring how we do that. So team-wise and business size-wise, that's going to change as well, and it already is changing. The question then becomes, what does it look like, for me at least, what does the world look like for either new businesses or old businesses when we have this ability, when it becomes a norm? And I think we're already seeing this. There's an interesting post this week from the CEO of Fiverr, a business that has been around for 16 years. He's been actually quite vocal in terms of talking about the impacts for them. And I believe their revenue is up, and there's a bunch of different things they're doing. But he said, we're going back to startup mode. And I take that to mean we have this speed and agility now that's available to us that was not available. So we almost need to change. Like a 16-year-old business going back to startup mentality says to me, wow, we have a blank slate, or a blanker slate, and we have the ability to move very quickly. We probably don't have the organizational muscles to do that. So we've got to rebuild that mindset to go back to, wow, we can move much, much quicker. Are you seeing that? What do you think about that?
There are people who have that intensity, and there's a lot of people who are just ignoring it because it hasn't yet impinged upon them in their balance sheets or their revenues. There's a chart from Goldman Sachs about agentic profit. And essentially, for us, we're already on fire about agents. You know, from our first episode, we're like, agents. Like, that's kind of when you and I were like, we got to start a podcast because we need to just talk about this once a week or we're going to fall behind. But really, agent profit from these new modes in Goldman Sachs, and I like this report. I read the report; it looks pretty good. Maybe we could do an episode on it once. Really doesn't hit until 2027 as an appreciable fraction of SaaS, and then by 2033, it's like more than SaaS, right? And I think there's a lot of people in the industry who are impacted when their profits are impacted. That's their main way of interacting with technologies. Well, when that becomes a problem, but then you're going to have 3 years until it's most of your revenue, right? So that you're not going to catch up if that's your starting point is in 2027. So I think there's a lot of people who are way behind. The people whose pants are on fire right now have been proven right, and they probably their pants were on fire 2 years ago about this. And I know, like, for instance, in software services, I have my friends who are just like, this is going to change everything. We need to get liquid. We need to get out. This is going to be wild, or we need to start over. And then there's people who are like, nah, technology comes and goes. And I think this is more towards the latter, but there's a lot of people only thinking in terms of dollars. In 2025 dollars.
Yeah. I think the challenge is what's ahead is a world where you're not just spitting out, you have an idea, you can manifest that quickly, you can test it quickly, and you can get to, I think this is true, right? We've probably seen the fastest growing businesses in history ever in the last handful of years.
Yeah, I heard about one today, and there's, just 0 to like 40 million in 24 months.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of things. Some people are selling $1 for 75 cents. And we saw this with cloud too. It's like, oh, I have this new SaaS product. It loses money on every transaction, but we're getting market share. And that worked out for a lot of people. But what you were doing, you're selling AWS, and you're paying $1 for AWS, and you were pricing your product plus AWS for 60 cents. And people looked at it and be like, well, I might as well get the cheap AWS. So there was a lot of kind of false starts there. And I think there's going to be a lot of false starts in terms of revenue growth because you're selling services at a discount, you're selling OpenAI credits at a discount, or you have some, free money, and they're hoping that their costs all converge. And a lot of times they're just not, especially on those super fast growing things. But then there's other stuff that's just like a revelation. Cursor is obviously hugely disruptive and potentially, could be like a Microsoft killer. If you look at that, I mean, like if you're doing code, why not Office 360? Okay, what's left of Microsoft after that? Like, really, I mean, it's a $4 trillion business, but there's not so much to it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that I think there's two components. Just to kind of restate my point. When you're in a world where you can launch new offerings to a market at a faster rate than you were previously, that's a skill set to be able to do all of that startups tend to have because they're, doing smaller stuff quicker. So, but I think that's a set of muscles that medium and large size business are going to have to re-exercise and kind of reanimate. But I think then the other interesting consideration here is, we talked about this before. Product. You used to say, "Oh my God, I've got this great idea and I validated and all the rest." And you're like, "Yeah, but you have the engineers to build it." Right. And so it was like when you're starting a business, like, well, 70% of the effort's going to be and the resources are going to go towards the engineers, and whatever's left will go to a bit of marketing and a bit of sales and, admin or whatever. I think the relative balance of the relative importance of product goes down in a business, which is a shame to say for somebody like me who's so sort of product centric. I think there are really three things that are important, and I've said this before. So obviously you got to have a product. You need to have domain knowledge, right? You need to understand what you're applying your product to, and arguably most importantly, you have to have access to the market. You have to distribution, whatever that actually looks like. Call it marketing for a second. I think that's where the biggest change is going to come in the next few years, because we'll all work out how to spit out product really quickly. We will have to find the domain knowledge. Some of us will have the domain knowledge already. That's great. But I kind of think the biggest upset and shift that needs to happen is, or will be, in the marketing space. And we're already seeing it, right? Where programmatic marketing, and what I mean by that is anything where you can generate a message or a piece of content and you send it out via email or whatever it is, the cost of that is heading to zero. So the value of it from a marketing perspective is heading to zero too, because us as consumers, like, I know this is a great email, but I know it wasn't sent by Matt, so we're going to become immune to that. And we're beginning, like I'm hearing rumblings, for example, that there's a renaissance in PR. Because PR is a really human to human. Oh, I know the journalist. Let me
Oh
call
my
him.
God. I listen. So one of my favorite podcasts, maybe my favorite at this point, is Dwarkesh, who I've mentioned many times before. And if you can get your startup placed on Dwarkesh, I'm sure it's just free money. And I'm like, I want to make a prediction that if Dwarkesh does not start a $1 billion fund in the next 2 years, like I think it's like a 50-50. Like he's just super connected. And yeah, like we went through this transition where getting, I remember one of the first big wins I had in my career is I got a report onto the front page of TechCrunch. It was like I'd been 3 months out of school, and we wrote this big report, and I was the data guy on the report. And it was on the front page of TechCrunch, and it was the last thing they published on Friday, which is the best, because then it was the front page all weekend because they didn't post on weekends. And I think that's a little bit foreign now. And now I think getting on some of these podcasts is having that same cachet. But yeah, in the middle, it was just, you're doing automated outbound, you have a BDR team, there was no real thing like TechCrunch anymore. And now I think we're reemerging that there's certain key institutions, like someone like Dwarkesh, can make a startup if you were to invite them on.
Yeah, and there's only so many Dwarkeshes, and his price is going to. I don't know what the economics are of his situation.
Well, that's the thing. It's like you can't really pay to play on a podcast. That's a little too starting a fund or being an advisor in a fund, and then like anybody who takes money from you also gets a podcast episode. I mean, that's what we've seen with like the All In podcast and stuff like that, is kind of trying to leverage media into building a bigger image for your own investment.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this for a while. I'm an engineer, so I was thinking kind of frames and models. And so on the marketing, the marketing construct that I have is you have to have your narrative, your story. That's why startups often have an advantage, right? It can be compelling and human and all the rest. So you've
Authentic.
got your story, right? Then you've got to build your authority. How do you go about building that? And only after you've built the authority can you then engage in kind of commercial conversations.
Hmm.
That building the authority part, you get onto Dwarkesh, there you go, boom, you're done, right? But right now we talk about content being king, right? You put good, high quality content out there. You make sure it's available in the right places. That's all shifting as well with SEO. You know, you've got kind of the answer economy happening as well. But it's really about content and I'm not an expert in this space, but what I see is all about generating more and more and more and more content. So programmatically generating content. So the cost is going to zero, but the value of that goes to zero. So beyond getting onto Dwarkesh or, getting on the front of TechCrunch, it's going to be interesting to see, I guess, do we just head back to the olden days of marketing pre-TV even, right? Because anything digital is, presumably AI generated content going forward.
Yeah, we when we had the conversation with the other Matt, and we did a little that little
On our
webinar.
webinar. Yeah.
Yeah, something he brought up there was just that it's like, oh, are the search engines picking you up? But the real question is the AI picking you up? So it's like, yeah, it's this move away from we were building the web. And so there was just not enough content on the web. So if you built great content, Google had an incentive to put your content on those first 5 links that showed up. Um, and what we see now is that like every possible permutation of high frequency questions is answered infinite number of times on the internet because you have generative content. And then simultaneously, the search engines, which Google was a search engine, and then OpenAI is like an emergent search engine. I got in a big fight with Claire last night on the way home. She was just like, "You use OpenAI to, like, I don't know, check the weather?" And I'm like, "I don't know. That's what I had open." She's like, "That uses so much more energy." And I'm like, "I don't care. Driving a car takes energy." She's like, "You can't, like use your car to check the weather. You can use Google. It's cached. Like, don't do that." And so it's like, I don't know. Both search engines to me, I'm yeah, whatever. Anyway, so I got my hand slapped. But even now that there's 100 answers on the internet because of all this generative content, now the search engine is going to read all of them simultaneously, create a generative thing, and then just give you one answer that doesn't even reference maybe where it
Yeah.
actually got the answer from in the beginning. So it's like, it's very weird. And what's emerging, like you said, is human networks or other networks that you have to think about. It's not just put content out and you have this kind of perfectly flat plane that your content sticks out on. You have to embed it into a network of
Yeah.
people, like events, advisors,
Yeah.
info.
IRL stuff. Just like Dwarkesh, we're also kingmakers. So let's call out Matt Perry, who you were referencing from Average Robot.
Yes.
So, folks, if you're interested in AI-enabled, empowered marketing, check out Average Robot. But it's interesting that you bring up kind of events. We've had great success in the last 12 months with IRL stuff, like in person. You can actually do it relatively cost effectively. What it doesn't have is that broad scale, but it's
Mhm.
authentic, it's human. You get to engage in a non-salesy type of a thing, which is really again around generating authority. So
Well,
anyway,
let's go back to the ease of building product and then reincorporate what we just said, which is, first, you can build products quickly, which is kind of a bummer for product people, but product people are also pretty good entrepreneurs in general. So you can actually build companies, whereas before it would have been a feature. Well, now you can build a product, and where it would have been a product, it can be a company. And where you would have gone out and built a big marketing campaign, instead you're going to go find 20 customers, meet with them in person. Well, that's all right, because it went from tools that cost $20 a month that were built to scale on the open web. The open web is dead, according to Google. When they're saying like, "Hey, yeah, we have monopoly search engine, but guess what? The open web is them anyway. So we're just an AI company, and we're competing with OpenAI, and so don't take away all of our monopoly power." So the open web's dead. So a $20 a month tool doesn't make any sense. But AI can also go replace a human being. So you can go sell, instead of $20 a month tool, a $20,000 a year company, product. And so that 20 customers, that's 400K. Boom. Whereas like it's the scope, the products become companies. They go from hundreds of dollars a year to thousands and tens of thousands of dollars a year, because they have so much more capability, and they're replacing, you're going into a market where they would have hired people or firms to do the work, and now it's just done by an agent. So it's like there's this kind of like it's not quite musical chairs, but everything's just shifting over.
Yeah, but I think this is the issue, because there's so much potential now in the products. Where you're like me as a product manager, when I think about what I can get done in a week, what I can manifest in a week versus what used to be a month or 6 weeks, like I need to think I'm like, oh, let's grab all this stuff from the roadmap, because we're going to be able to do all of that. Like, that's awesome, right? It's still blocked by how do we get out that in front of customers, and you
Mm-hmm.
have to kind of earn the right to do that over time. And the last 5 to 10 years, that's been very, programmatic sort of paid approach. I think it's been shifting,
Mm-hmm.
but it's shifting very quickly. So if somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, look, I'm thinking about starting this business, got this awesome product," I used to be like, "Tell me all about the product," and now I'm like, "Okay, how are you going to access the market? And by the way, what do you know about this space?" Because the other part is the domain knowledge. If you have to learn the domain knowledge to inform your roadmap on the product, that's actually going to slow you down. It's great that you can develop the product in a day, but you don't know what product to develop, right?
So I think
Where
what you're outlining here is that old guys are going to have jobs still. Old.
God, I hope so. God,
Yeah. And when I say guys, obviously, I mean all genders
yeah, peeps.
and things like that. But yeah, a bunch of people. You can go tap into networks. You can go raise money. Um,
Yes, all of the above. Yeah,
and,
yeah,
and yeah, having experienced founders out there is great. And I think AI kind of caught everybody. And there's a lot of these, 25-year-olds getting $1 billion checks. All right, now that we have to go build applications and actually go market them, I'm not saying that's me, but I have like unique advantages. But I would much rather be me now than me 15 years
yeah,
ago if I was trying to do that, right?
yeah, yeah.
So,
So, all right. You want to shift to interesting things this week?
oh my God, you
All right.
start.
Well,
I need
I've
a
got a
brief
good
one.
one. I tell you what grabbed my attention. You might have some opinions on this. NVIDIA chips being banned by China. So Chinese companies, it's a rumor, are no longer allowed purchase NVIDIA chips. What I've also heard more recently is Chinese stock exchange is up, I think close to all-time highs, on the back of progress around technology companies, particularly AI. Alibaba is building their own chips. I think maybe Baidu as well. You've got geopolitical conversation. So it might look like that China is trying to stick one over on the US by saying, yeah, we're not going to buy your chips. But I think it's probably more leaning towards encouraging sort of the indigenous industry to move as quickly as possible around AI.
Yeah, Stratechery did a good segment on this, which I think highlights everything, and he's very authoritative, so I trust Ben Thompson. But the interest of NVIDIA to be in China is twofold. One, selling chips makes them money. And two, they want to have their proprietary method of communicating with GPUs, which is called CUDA, CUDA, to remain the industry standard. And they had been developing CUDA for many, many years. So when it came time to develop your own AI program, you could have low-level access with a high-level abstraction via CUDA. So you could develop your AI application more quickly. And then the chips that run CUDA are faster. So everyone continues to optimize their software chains that live on top of CUDA. And so they have this nice lock-in. And it's very similar to what you would have seen Microsoft, for instance. Like you had the the Windows became, that's where you build the application. And then because there's so many applications that have customers, and there's a similar type of lock-in effect with CUDA. What they're worried about is that they're going to be an Android that pops up to CUDA as the analogy to iOS. And if China doesn't have access to NVIDIA chips, then it will have to develop its own tool chains from the GPU all the way up to this higher level abstraction. And once there's right now there's CUDA and nothing else basically. And then actually there's the TPUs at Google, which are also pretty performant. But wow, what if it was an open source one and it also had a billion people who could only access any AI via this new system? Well, that's of course going to be similar to Android, a massive drag on the potential profits and the potential leadership position that NVIDIA can have. So it's existential that they get into China. And I think that's what happened was Trump had all of these statements where he cut off the supply of these H20 chips, which had been designed to service China under rules that were set during the Biden administration. And then Trump came in and said, we're going to cut you off unless you give us deals on rare earth magnets and all those things that China's dominated the mining and refinement of. And he said, you need our chips because you're locked into us. And so you can't do AI unless you use NVIDIA chips, and I have control over them. So he said the quiet part out loud. There's always this implicit threat, but it made it up to Xi. He's, getting direct, like, you need to do all this stuff for me or I'm not going to give you AI chips. And so Xi thought about it for a second. He's like, yeah, why would we want to retain this relationship if, if we attack Taiwan, all those chip fabs are going to be destroyed. Well, if we have our own chip manufacturing ecosystem, that's actually now it makes it easier for us to invade Taiwan. So it was kind of a blunder on the part of the Trump administration. They went into reverse, but now China realizes they have the upper hand because breaking up NVIDIA's monopoly is more important. Sorry, that's a long digression. But
no, it's great because there's one other assumption I think that's in there is that the rate of advancement of AI is assumed to be somewhat moderate in the sense of they're coming from behind and they assume that there's enough time. Remember AI 2027, the report? If they believed that, they'd be like, we don't have time, we're never going to catch up in time to, be in battle with them in 2027. So
yeah,
I don't know how long
the key piece in that AI 2027 was that the US and China both did things that were against their both of their interests because they were worried about the other gaining complete control. So China is indicating that it's not worried in the 2 to 3 year time frame about losing access to potentially an AI that's self-reinforcing and has this runaway effect, which means that the US no longer has to make potentially adverse decisions because of the threat of China. It's like, do you want to be killed by China or potentially killed by an AI? Well, now China is kind of taking themselves out of the near-term race in order to develop a completely independent ecosystem is one way of thinking about China rejecting the H20s.
Yep, I agree. All right, Matt, anything else you want to cover before we wrap up?
Apple has like a alternative to GPUs using flash memory. I heard a rumor. I got to go research.
I thought you meant Adobe Flash for a second. I was like, okay.
Bringing back Macromedia. Yeah. I have not done enough research, but I want to look at alternative inference methods going forward because potentially there's tricks that can be played and they've been using GPUs, but they don't need to. And so there's a potential to disrupt NVIDIA using alternative inference methods. So that's on the horizon.
Let's land it there. Another good chat, Matt. We will see you next week.
See you next time.
Bye now.